It's official. Donald Trump just struck Iran. 3 nuclear sites have been struck: Esfahan, Natanz, and Fordow. Now, Donald Trump says all American airships are now in safe space outside of Iranian airspace. My expectation, as it has been over the last few days, is that Donald Trump would never actually announce ahead of time that these strikes are going to occur, because they would jeopardize the American mission. It appears now the mission is complete. Now, what's very interesting here is we have now struck facilities that have already been struck twice, or actually multiple times by the Israelis. Natanz has been struck repeatedly since almost day one of this incursion. This is one of your uranium enrichment sites. Esfahan is also an enrichment site, but what's unique about Esfahan is it's a storage facility for enriched uranium. At least that's where it was last seen by the IAEA inspectors, who were allegedly inspecting nuclear sites within Iran multiple times per day up until the Israeli strikes began. Now, Fordow, as far as we're aware and have been told, has not been struck by Israelis yet, but just this morning we put a video together suggesting that the Israeli military was clearing the path from the Persian Gulf to the south of Iran, and likely where aircraft from the United States would enter the Iranian airspace from potentially Qatar or the Saudi Arabian Peninsula or wherever else. It all aligns now that strikes have taken place today. Obviously, it is Saturday, it's a weekend. Bitcoin has fallen to about 101, which is just below its 102 support line. So we're seeing some negative market reaction. This does mean the United States has stepped foot into this war of Iran versus Israel. And questions now are, is this it? Donald Trump suggests that the next best phase is a peaceful next phase. That is, hopefully we can return to peace. And this was these were in my scenarios with my course members in the Alpha Report, and we've talked about this on the channel as well. So my best case scenario, when we set up trading scenarios, we say, okay, if this, then this, right? So for example, we might say like, hey, if Circle goes down in the first 5 minutes of trade, be prepared to pick up a bounce on it, because it could shoot up 20%. It's exactly what happened on Friday, for example. You could look at the history of it. You could go look at the Alpha Report history of it in the course member live streams. But the point is, we gave scenarios for best case scenario. Best case scenario number 1 was a negotiated solution. Obviously, some form of capitulation from Iran, that they would stop enriching prior to strikes from the United States. Khamenei obviously made it very clear this morning that the negotiations in Geneva were not acceptable, started allocating and delegating replacements to himself as well as others in the Iranian military and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, should they be taken out. Suggesting this really like heel digging in by Iran, this idea of, all right, look, we're not going to go to zero enrichment. These deals that were being offered in Geneva are not good. We're not interested in these negotiations, so we're just going to set up and dig in here. Unfortunately, that came at the same time as we were bringing more B-2 bombers into the region, so unsurprisingly, negotiations weren't going anywhere, and we were basically walking up towards these strikes occurring, which have now officially been carried out. Now, we've talked about Esfahan. We don't know if the 15 barrels of highly enriched uranium are actually at Esfahan. We don't know if they have now been destroyed through the bombs that the United States has dropped. It is expected that the United States is basically coming in as the mop-up crew. So, in other words, we are striking in a manner that the Israelis cannot. The Israelis take out anti-aircraft launchers such as SAM, surface-to-air missile facilities or vehicles, and then also prepare a path for B-2 bombers. B-2 bombers get refueled off the coast of Iran. Very normal. Yes, a B-2 bomber fully loaded without bombs, in other words, fully fueled without bombs, could make it to Iran from a significant distance. However, once you're carrying 30,000-pound bombs, this is a little different. Now, we're going to have to wait and see what kind of footage comes out of the actual bombardments, but Donald Trump suggests that these strikes have been successful. I would suspect there were likely in the neighborhood to hit 3 different sites. We're probably looking at somewhere between 6 to 12 B-2 bombers that were used in this attack, each dropping about 2 bombs, along with potentially also F-16s, which we've already seen building up in Saudi Arabia in bases that the United States and allied forces can operate in. So, what does this mean? Well, we talked to Esfahan. Potentially some of the enriched uranium, had it not been moved, is now destroyed. Generally, enriched uranium is not considered a nuclear hazard for fallout purposes, so less of a concern there. Natanz has already been bombarded pretty heavily, so it's likely that just got finished off. Now, the strike on Fordo, we've been talking about for about a week now. This should be, based on what we're hearing, the first strike on Fordo, and it's basically the initial strike and the final strike. So now the question is, so first best case scenario was a negotiated solution before strikes. Second best case scenario is a negotiated solution after strikes. What we're hoping for now, and sorry if I have food in my teeth, I stepped out of a wedding because I saw these strikes were taking place. So what happens when you have notifications on for Truth Social, and a shout out to the team as well for being like, Kevin, are you on this? Anyway, so now first case scenario didn't work out. Negotiated solution before strikes, that didn't happen. Best next case scenario is the negotiated solution post strikes. This is where Iran basically says, okay, look, we effed up. We give up. We will go to zero enrichment. Because again, you have to remember, and I understand this is sort of boring like science, but you have to understand, if you enrich U-235 for peaceful purposes, you could also use that U-235 for weapons. You can't start a peaceful nuclear program. You can't start the fission reactions without U-235. You can have 97% U-238, but you need that 3% U-235. So you need that 235 nuclear energy grade and weapons grade uranium, which you have to refine through centrifugal processes. Even a peaceful program yields a plutonium plutonium 239, which can also be used in weapons. So the component in a peaceful energy program can be used for weapons. The byproduct of a peaceful energy program can be used in weapons. And then obviously you could just use straight up U-235 for weapons themselves. So now best case scenario is Iran backs down and says, well, we're done. We won't enrich anymore. You got us. You hit us hard. Done. A lot of people have been asking me, how could they have potentially struck Fordo? Because it's not just a 2D surface of knowing where to strike, where a spy, basically paints a spot, a GPS coordinate, and you strike that spot. It is also a third dimension of knowing how deep to go. You have to get through potential false cavities, false tunnels, and you have to make sure the bomb doesn't go too far. Otherwise, even a 30,000-pound bomb, which is mostly metal, 25,000 pounds of it are metal, 5,000 pounds are the actual warhead. You have to actually target that to detonate at the right three-dimensional depth. I suspect it's likely that the United States had satellite imagery of when these sites were constructed and basically went into the archives to say, oh, okay, yeah, we know exactly what's going where. And that's how these strikes were carried out in a successful manner. Now, then again, we also have to evaluate, were the strikes really successful? Because everything Trump does is successful. Okay, his words. So we kind of have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. But let's assume for a moment that the strikes were not successful. Very embarrassing for Donald Trump. It is possible Iran could argue that the strikes were not successful, and this would go into a third case scenario, which is not one of our first or second best case scenarios. It is a worst case scenario. And it is a situation where Iran says, your strikes failed, you didn't get our stuff, now we're definitely making a bomb. This is bad because it potentially leads to a protracted war, prolonged war, or conflict. And then, of course, worst case scenario number 4 is some form of actual troop deployment to verify, or commando-supported deployment by the Israelis, supported by the U.S., to verify that the job is complete and the Iranians are not enriching uranium. Notice none of what I'm saying is regime change. You don't want regime change, because then you have... we've talked about this so much. I'm sorry, I feel like this is redundant. As quickly as possible. If you take out a regime, you leave a power vacuum. Who's going to replace it? Are you going to somehow orchestrate elections like you did in Iraq? Nobody's going to trust the elections. Are you going to put the Israeli military in position? Nobody's going to trust them or believe that. And you got a Gaza 2.0. Nobody wants that. You're going to take a U.S.-assigned government? Nobody wants that either. So the people would have to elect a government and trust that election process. It just hasn't been successfully done. What's better is that the regime realizes, all right, we're not going to enrich uranium. We step back. So the question now is, how bad is the response going to be? And that's what we have to see. Hopefully the strikes indeed, now that they have been carried out, hopefully the strikes were indeed successful. If they were indeed successful, then yes, we can get to a negotiated solution if Iran is open to it. Let's hope, because if not, we get into a situation where oil skyrockets over 100, Potentially we get retaliation in the Strait of Hormuz shutting down. And now we're in a situation where oil's over 100, over 125. We start getting into recessionary territory based on consumer purchasing power going in an environment where employment is already very weak. Now, that's not existing unemployment levels. It would be the level of hiring. Hiring is very weak. Job vacancies are weak. So it's a rough time. It's a sensitive time for the economy to try to absorb more of this sort of damage. So I'll just have to wait and see what happens. Follow for more. I will keep you updated. Thank you so much.